Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello. Happy time zone. So it's just me today, unfortunately. I think some folks have seen Christos has left Microsoft. So it's going to be JP and I. Unfortunately, JP is off chasing down the next topic that we're going to be focusing on within our team. So it's just me today. Hopefully that's exciting. And we've got a really cool topic today, right? Well, I guess cool in the sense of I guess probably it should have happened by now. It's happening now, and we've been reached out to by the way of the Exchange Online team. So, without further ado, let me bring our guest on and we'll kind of talk a little bit about what's going on at Microsoft in the realm of Exchange Online. So, good morning.
Morning, Shannon. How are you?
Good, good. So this is Greg Taylor. He's one of our principal product managers at Microsoft in the Exchange Online team. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your day today?
Absolutely, Shannon. And this is something that has rarely been called cool. So I'm looking forward to how we can spin
We'll
this
work
whole
on
thing
it. We'll
around.
work on it.
But
We'll work
let's
on it.
figure that one out. So hi, I'm Greg Taylor. I'm a product manager in the M365 core engineering team. So I kind of work on the guts of our service, which Exchange is obviously a major part of. I'm focused very much on Exchange security, and I've been working on Exchange at Microsoft for 17 years, I think, something
Are you
along
supposed
those
to say
lines.
that out loud though? That feels
I
long.
mean,
You've
you
seen a
know,
lot.
I've 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 done a lot of email. You know, a lot of those emails that you get and really appreciate, I'm sure. Yeah, I've had a hand in some of those probably. So yeah, I've been doing it
Wow.
a while.
So we're here today to talk about basic authentication deprecation. And I think, it sounds sort of not exciting, but it's important, right? And it's the idea of we're trying to get some of this info out there into the broader community so that folks
Sure.
are aware because, customers don't tend to pay attention to all of the different ways that we alert them. So we try to think of every way to get this info out to customers, right?
Yeah, and so yeah, so this is a pretty major change that we're making, um, and and it is not a change we're making flippantly or just for the heck of it, right? We're genuinely trying to help protect customers' data, customers' accounts from the most common way their accounts, from for basic auth is one of the most, if not the most common and easy way accounts and data get compromised from
Right.
our service and anybody's service. And and to be clear, basic auth is this term we throw around. So let me kind of, if it's okay, I'll just kind of
Yeah.
introduce that a little bit, which is
Yeah. Let's start with that.
because there's a great term, basic auth and modern auth. They're not great terms in their own right. I mean, everything is modern at some point. Um, Basic auth in this case simply means just using a username and a password to get access to a resource, in this
Right.
case, email.
Right.
Um, we're trying to replace it with what we call modern auth, which really is OAuth 2.0 based authorization authentication. So an OAuth 2 or a modern auth based solution, which involves tokens and allows for easy MFA and a whole bunch of other clever stuff, right?
Right.
So we have historically, obviously, we've all used just straight usernames and passwords to get access to stuff.
Right.
And we've supported all of that, and Exchange and email are one of those historical things that have been around for a very long time. And that was all you could use. Well, we still have many, many people still using that to get access to their email. What we really want to try and do is move our customers away from that to using modern auth, to
Okay.
using OAuth based authentication, using MFA and all of that good stuff, and get away from using basic auth.
Makes sense. So if you were to let our listeners know today why basic auth is considered bad and why modern auth is considered good, is
Right.
there like an elevator pitch? It's one of those things where we feel as though identity is one of those areas that everybody implements one time, and it's username and a password, and you put a password policy on, or you bring about other things. So maybe walk folks through why this is important, just so that we can, make that kind of hit it home.
Sure. So that going back to exactly what you just said, that's kind of the root of the problem, which is you set it up once,
Right. You
and
don't
then
want to do it again.
and so the difficulty is, or therein lies our challenge. You take the username and password, you generally put them in an application, and the application or the device or whatever it is stores your credentials, and then with every request sends your credentials over the wire, says, "Here's my username and password. Can I please have my stuff?" Great. Probably though, those credentials could be used anywhere where Basic Auth is enabled. That same user account and password can probably be used to access something else. So then what happens is let's say your corporate credentials are being stored inside an application. Um, and then anywhere where your corporate credentials can be used to access a resource, they could be reused and accessed.
Right.
So it could be entirely separate from email. It could be an entirely different thing.
Right.
And so what all too often happens then is these credentials get compromised. People use the same passwords over and over again, right? So they get compromised in a number of ways. So let's just talk about that for a second, right? So it could be credential theft. So credentials are intercepted, man in the middle attack type stuff. Credentials get compromised, and then attackers will use those credentials against as many different endpoints as they can. Um, or credentials might be guessed.
Right. Okay.
We all use the same passwords over and over. We're probably, and this is probably the wrong audience for that, right? Because
Well, it's interesting. We're sort of a mixed bag. We have folks who get it. We have folks who are starting to pay attention to it, and so they're asking all sorts of questions. So I feel as though it's a mixed bag of folks who are probably tuning in today, right? So it's not only folks that understand why modern auth is good. It's folks that are also tuning in that are like, "Wait, what is this? Why is this
right,
important?" Right?
and some of those, all of us, right? Probably reuse passwords from time to time. Have
Yeah,
done,
right, right,
and we're better at it. With password managers and all of that stuff that happens now. But if in IT people, right, are probably better at it than most. One would hope. But I guarantee even then, some of them still reuse passwords. And so the interesting change over the last 15, 20 years has probably been that, when I started doing IT and stuff, it was your login name was not your email address. It was a
okay,
VPN. It was some
right,
some other reference. So you had a username and a password. Well, now we set up SMTP address as your username. So you log in with your email address. Well, your email address is not typically private, right? Everyone knows your email address.
right.
So whoever wants to compromise you already knows what your username is. They've already guessed. They've got 50% of the data they need. Now they've just got to guess your password.
Okay.
And so because we typically use the same passwords over and over, well, many users do, or they use very simplistic passwords, and the passwords are set to never expire, back to your password policy, right?
Right.
Because passwords changing is a real pain and users
Yeah.
don't
Is this
like
where
it.
I say I have done that with some of my demos? I'm
hmm
like, "Please, I
We've
don't
all
need
done it,
this to expire, right? I need this to
right?
just
We've all done
stay."
it.
Right.
Then that's how the credentials get compromised.
Right.
And so it's too easy. And so the largest segment where we know this happens is small medium business in the EDU, right? And so they're the most common segments, right? When I think about kind of where account compromise and everything happen. And SMB, that's because they don't have IT professionals, they don't have security people forcing them to change passwords and use more secure methods. They set it up once. They say, don't ever make me change my password. It's simple and it works.
Right.
And then they carry on. In and in large enterprises, you find they build applications. There are either they integrate an application or they build an application and then they hard code the creds in it.
Right, right.
And those creds are sent every time the application makes a request. So, that's what we're trying to get away from, right? That kind of storage and reuse of credentials all the time is just so easily compromised. And I talk to customers, unfortunately, all the time who've been compromised like that. And
Yeah.
all in exchange specifically, Because Exchange has been around quite a while, the default is that these protocols, all the protocols that are impacted by the change that we're making, have basic auth enabled on them. And that was how people used to connect. And so there are many customers who don't go back and close those doors, right? Once they move to modern auth, perhaps they've already done the effort. They've gone and moved users onto something more secure, but they've gone and left basic auth still enabled. So, so what we're trying to do is close down basic auth completely. What I've already done is turned off basic auth for millions of tenants who didn't even know it was still
I know.
enabled.
I thought that was crazy. So I tuned into
Millions.
your Twitter Spaces and I sort of
Right.
chuckled because if you would have done that 10 years ago, there would have been all kinds of tickets, right? But because we've
Right.
been moving towards more modern authentication just in general, overall,
hmm
and holistically as customers adopt this for the enterprise,
hmm
I'm sure you didn't have as many tickets or as many people saying, "Gosh, my application's broken," right? Maybe you did. I mean, I'm almost assuming too that customers may have turned it back on, right? There's
Yeah.
probably a handful.
So, yeah, and as a percentage, and anyone who I affected, directly by this, if you're listening, sorry, right? But we we're
Some
trying,
experiments, right?
yeah, somewhat, right? I mean, but a pretty accurate one. So let me explain how that's kind of worked. So what we've been doing since middle of last year, middle of 21,
Okay.
is is tracking tenants' usage of Basic Auth at a tenant level. So I know which tenants use Basic Auth and which do not. And of those that do, I know which protocols they use. Now, there are specific protocols that we're actually going to turn off. And let me just share my screen. How about I do that?
Okay, perfect.
Just for the heck of it, right? Because this nicely summarizes the protocols that we're actually going to affect here. So the POP and IMAP and the protocols Outlook uses that are listed there, ActiveSync and PowerShell. So I've been tracking that since middle of 21. And after several, in fact, even probably even longer, right? Um, so I know who uses this stuff. And then what we've been doing is communicating with those that use it
Okay.
via message center post directly with message center post. I've been doing the mother of all mail merges, right? Where we send to all the tenants that use Basic Auth, we send a monthly message center post the first week of each month. We've been doing it since October last year, 21, and saying, we know you use Basic Auth. Here's a rough idea of the number of users we see using Basic Auth in your tenant
Okay.
each month. If you do not get that message, you're not using Basic Auth. But you'll probably find in your message center some other messages from me and my team, which is we've already turned stuff off.
Aha.
So because you've not been using it, we've gone and turned it off.
Okay.
Now, we currently, up until October 1st, 2022, which is the big date we should talk about, up until that date, you can go in and re-enable it. So if we've gone and turned it off because we don't think you use it and we got it wrong, maybe because your usage is tiny and we didn't see it, and
Okay.
there's a weird subtle nuance there that where we look for the data. So very small usage we can occasionally miss, or you decided you wanted to start using it, right? And we've just turned it off. You can turn it back on. You go in the Exchange admins or the Microsoft Admin Center, sorry. You can go into the self-help process. You can actually re-enable the protocols yourself. Within 15 minutes, they're back on. As a percentage of those tenants that we have turned off, it's fractional, minimal, incredibly small percentage of customers that we've actually had go and turn something back on.
Okay.
Interestingly, many that have, I'll tell you, we've turned off one protocol, or they use one protocol, but they go and turn everything back on, which is kind of a sign that they're not really sure what they're using, right? They're kind of POP3 stops working, but
Right.
we've turned off everything, right? We turned off everything, and all they need is POP3, and they turn everything back on. I can kind of see that in telemetry, and that kind of is a giveaway that I'm not sure they know what they're really using. But for the most part, it's we target really, really well.
Okay. Now, we've gotten a question here. So, Hellgreen, thanks for tuning in. The question is, what should I be aware of if I use Basic Auth on my on-prem Exchange server? So, we're talking more so about Exchange Online, but is there any intersection that somebody might need to be aware of if they're still hosting parts of their Exchange environment on-prem?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a good opportunity to clarify. You're quite right, Shannon, though, that this affects only Exchange Online. So we're
Okay.
turning off Basic Auth only in Exchange Online. Exchange on-prem, you can leave Basic Auth enabled as long as you want, and so on. Not that you should, though, right?
It's probably not a
Because
good idea, right?
well, there are other. I mean, one of the reasons customers run Exchange on-prem still is they want that flexibility, and maybe they have legacy applications that
Sure.
they can't, that they need to keep on-prem, and that's fine. Protect it, right? Make sure that you're not exposing basic auth out to the internet through your firewall, and do all of that protective stuff that you should. I mean, bear in mind that a lot of compromise that goes on is not necessarily external, like Hollywood would have, everyone believe that there are hackers coming through the firewall all the time. Most of that is
Right
a
now,
lot of
right?
internal, exactly right
Right.
now, and it's in red. They're serious, right? Um, but on-prem, it's compromised accounts and internal and all of that stuff, right? So
Right.
the basic auth all up, is something to be aware of. There are other options on-prem too. So hybrid modern auth, which means you can use the same OAuth-based authorization authentication flow as you do against the cloud, and you can use that on-prem as well. I was the PM for that a few years ago, so
Ah,
I'm
very
quite
cool.
familiar with how that works.
Very
But
cool.
yeah, good question. But on-prem, this change doesn't affect that at all.
Okay, well, that's good to know. So then if if I think about some of the questions that we had worked on, because we always, come up with some questions
Sure.
beforehand. Um, you know, so we covered what date we're turning it off. Microsoft is turning it off on October 1st. Now, I guess the next question would be, why now? I know you said that you've started in on this, I guess, awareness messaging October of last year. What's really critical about right now?
Well, it's a good question, and we actually announced this in September 2019 that we were going to do this. So in September 2019, we said in a year from now, we're going to turn off Basic Auth and Exchange Online. A little while after we did that, it was obvious that there wasn't a lot of movement. Let's be honest, right? A lot of customers, um, and it goes back to one of the points you made earlier, Shannon, right? Which is how do customers learn about this, right? Um, the number of people who might listen to this or read our blog or read the message center as a
And
percentage of our customers is not great.
right. So maybe it's a good idea to showcase the short URL that we created.
Okay.
Just this is literally the landing page for all of our documentation. And as Microsoft documentation goes, you click on it and there's of other links within the articles and on the left of the screen. So this is a great landing spot to go to read more about it because, I think it's hard, right? It's hard when you make these big changes because maybe your customers aren't paying attention to the right blogs, the right messages, the right maybe not even going into Message Center. I used to work for a customer who
Mm.
never did that, right? And I was helping them migrate and they didn't even know what the heck the messaging center was. So
The
it's a little bit of
smaller
an
the
education, right?
Yeah, precisely, and the smaller the customer, you can actually plot it on a chart, right? Is the larger customers typically read the message center
Right.
posts because they have IT people, right? And that's their
Correct.
job,
Correct.
part of their job. Um, which always gets me then, because then when I talk to companies who are large and they have a whole bunch of IT folks and nobody's read the message center, you're like,
You're like,
right,
"Okay, so this is the message center. Please read it."
right,
Because I have my own
important
personal
stuff.
tenant and I get a
And
number of messages, right? And it's pretty consistently throughout the week about
and
changes, things to be paying attention to.
and to be fair though, one could argue we send too many messages, right? And
Yeah,
so
it
and
true.
so after a while, it's like a bit like the boy who cried wolf, right? Which of these should I be paying attention to? So I kind of get it. So we've tried to sort of cover our bases. We do blogs and message center and social media, and we do a bunch of stuff. So back in 2019, we said we're going to do this thing. We then did a reality check. Customers gave us good feedback, which is a polite Microsoft way of saying they were like, "Oh hell no, we're not going to do this." Or we realized, it's going to take a while because big changes like this they take a while.
Right.
So we adjusted the date, and then we had a pandemic, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
so in reality, priorities changed. many of our customers said, like, we've got other things to focus on, remote work and figuring out how the heck we're going to, you know, carry on a day-to-day business. So we put it on hold. We put it on hold, and many of the customers I spoke to still continue with it because I tell you, there's not a single customer I talk to, and I talk to a lot, who think this is a bad idea. They're
Right.
all on board, right? Everyone's like, this is nothing but a good thing. The problem is the timing.
Right.
So back last year, we put out this blog statement. We put a date on it. We said beginning October 1st, 2022, and I'll highlight that as beginning. We will roll from October 1st this year, turning off Basic Auth for all of our customers. And we won't be everyone on October 1st. That would be a really rough day at support, but it will be pretty quick, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then and then you know that's what we're doing now. And I'll call out, on the slide here that I had, it's not that the protocols are being turned off. So just to clarify, it's just Basic Auth for the protocol. So your
Good.
iPhone
Yeah.
that
Good
uses
distinction.
your
Because
iPhone that
I read
uses
it too
Active,
fast.
right? And so I commonly get the question like, oh, you're turning off ActiveSync. No, we're not. We're turning off Basic Auth for ActiveSync. So that that Android or Apple device that you've got, which does ActiveSync to talk to Exchange, can do OAuth, and it should. Now, actually, it's a good opportunity we should actually just talk about, because we've actually done a pretty huge piece of work with Apple to try and help customers in that boat. So there you go. Look at that. It's almost like we had that planned there, Shannon, right? Brilliant.
Psst, we did.
Several years ago. So here was the thing. As we were doing this announcement, like way back, 2019, there's a realization that there are millions of iPhones using Basic Auth against Exchange Online, and there kind of still are, right? There's a lot. And the interesting thing is they're all up-to-date modern iPhones. I'll also tell you it's an interesting comparison when you look at the usage of our commercial service, M365, versus consumer, Outlook.com. Our commercial service, all the devices are up to date. Consumer, it's all the old iPads and iPhones, from years ago. So very different versions of device that connect to us. In our commercial service, you have all these brand new devices that are all up to date, but they're using Basic Auth. And we knew that, and we started to talk to Apple. And you understand, well, why is that the case? Why is a brand new iPhone still doing Basic Auth? Well, it's doing Basic Auth because when that email account was first set up, when a person had an iPhone or an iPad several years ago, they had a mailbox in Microsoft 365, Exchange
Hmm.
Online. They configured it. It would use Basic Auth because that was all
Right.
the apps supported.
Right.
They then go and get a shiny new iPhone, you know, and the first thing your shiny new iPhone does is it says, "Do you want me to transfer all your data and settings from your old phone?" You're like, "Yeah, that sounds awesome." So you get all your pictures and music and settings and everything come across, which includes your email settings and the fact that it's using Basic Auth. So now you've got the newest iPhone there is, still using Basic Auth, despite the app supporting modern auth. Now there's a quick solution, right? One which is remove the email account from the phone and add it back, and you'll find that it triggers the modern auth flow. You get the
Hmm.
Microsoft Online login
Okay.
page or whatever, and all that good stuff. But telling all those people to remove the account from their phone and add it back, is
It's
problematic.
probably a nightmare.
It is a bit. Depending, ones and twos here and there, fine. But we have large organizations have a lot of iPhones. Now, if they have MDM solutions managing their phones, that's slightly different. If you have an MDM, like an Intune or an AirWatch or something, pushing a profile to the device, then that's what you should be using to solve this modern auth, basic auth problem. You should be pushing a new profile saying, don't use basic auth, use modern auth. Done. But what about all those millions of small business customers and others that don't have MDM, but have lots of iPhones? So we work with Apple to figure out a way to automatically try and migrate the accounts from using Basic Auth to Modern Auth. And the link on screen is a link to a blog we put out a couple of weeks ago where we talk about this for the first time, and we say that very soon, and we're not quite at the point of we're not quite ready to release which version or announce which version it is Apple have put this code into, but the idea is that this new code will attempt to migrate the device or the account, mail account on the device from using Basic Auth to Modern Auth, which will enormously help us.
Nice. We did get a funny comment from, Fuel Snable. He had mentioned well, I don't know. I They had mentioned a good way to lose customers, the idea is to give all iPhone users an Android. That was the gist of the comment, but as you know, people
Sure,
love their iPhones.
they
So
do. And I can tell you statistically, I'm not going to share, but I can tell you we have a lot of iPhone users connecting to our service.
Oh, I'm sure.
The data that is kind of interesting, but
I'm sure.
it's a huge thing that we did with Apple there, and it was a real collaboration effort working with the team that work on the Mail app, and that's both iOS and Mac OS, and with us to figure out how we could try and do the best we can to automatically migrate a lot of these customers from one auth to another seamlessly. And many of these customers are not even going to know anything changed because email will just keep working,
Yeah. I didn't even think about that.
which is a whole lot better than email stopping working.
Well,
Because
that's when everybody's upset, right?
email is for all, we laugh about, we all get too much email and blah blah blah, right? It's pretty important for a lot of businesses and
It
people,
is.
their day-to-day lives. I hear all kinds of stories about how dependent people are on email, and it might not be, if you architecturally know, how how it works. You realize that email is not a guaranteed delivery mechanism. I send it, it should turn up. And these days it pretty much does, but didn't always, and it has a
Yeah.
back off and retry mechanism. Email isn't the best way to send super critical messages, but we all know that's how email is used.
Oh, I know.
And
All the
so
time.
and so if I interrupt email for customers and stop them getting email, bad stuff is going to happen. So this is one of the reasons why we're trying to do this really thoughtfully and communicate as much as we can to make sure customers really understand where they're using Basic Auth, so that when we turn it off, they're not entirely caught by surprise.
Yeah, makes sense. There was another funny comment in the chat. Email stops working, I don't get meeting invites, which
Yeah,
is probably also a good thing, but, it's not going to be a good long-term solution, especially if you wanna remain gainfully employed. People do love their meetings
right,
too, right? So
right. Yeah, I mean, on the whole, I think people, who rely on email would like it to keep working. So, whilst, not getting email might be a good short-term solution, it generally isn't for me. I have customers. So we're doing this thing. One of the other things that's on the slide here is this sort of temporary interruption of service, which is something that we are doing right now, which is we are temporarily turning off Basic Auth for protocols.
okay.
And this is something we haven't really done before. We are warning customers. We've told customers this is coming. We post to the service health dashboard when we do it. I'll share that we're very much more focused on the small medium business end of the world than the large enterprise, right?
Sure.
Um, because again, goes back to what I said earlier. They don't read the message center, right? The small
It's
customers
true.
do. They just don't.
It's
They
true.
don't hang on every blog I put out, like waiting for the next one, and they don't follow me on Twitter. So they don't know we're doing this. So we interrupt their service for a bit. Now they can always immediately go and use Outlook on the web, they can use the browser, they can use a different email client, but many of them suddenly email stops working and they have to realize what the heck's happened here and go figure it out. Now they can go turn it back on, but this is temporary, right?
Yeah,
So
makes
come
sense.
October, it's going to get serious.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, let's talk a little bit about the admins, right? Because they're the
Yes.
ones that are in the hot seat if email stops working.
Yeah.
What could they do to arm themselves better for October 1st? Is there
Great.
any
Yes.
telemetry, any tools that they can deploy or use?
Great question. Right. So let's just talk about that for a second because we need the help of, it's kind of a couple of big, I would say, groups that we really need some help with here, right? There's the IT admins, the IT pros, and we'll talk about that quickly as well. We'll
Okay.
talk about that mainly here for now. And then the second one is the developer community, because the IT pros are going to discover that there's a bunch of applications still using Basic Auth and that there's nothing they can do about it. Now, things like Outlook and iPhones and Androids, they can, the IT pro can generally communicate with the users and tell them to change their settings, configuration, and some of the applications they use, you know, Cisco voicemail and I don't know, Veeam and all of these other kind of applications they might have integrated all have OAuth capable options. So the IT pro can entirely handle this. Identify the apps, we'll talk about that in a second, go remediate.
Okay.
However, the developers need to do the work in the products to be able to convert basic auth to modern auth or use modern auth instead of basic in the apps. And so actually, the next stream,
It'll be
whenever
tomorrow
tomorrow,
morning. Yep.
is going to be a counterpart of mine who I work with, who's going to show how you can re-plumb an existing, Exchange Web Services app, which is using basic auth, into using modern auth. Keep the app the same, just change the authentication.
Nice.
So the two together, really important. So IT Pro for the moment, let's focus on that. So on screen here, I mentioned earlier, we send message center posts. We send message center posts every month to quite a lot of tenants saying, here's what your usage looks like. It's a an approximation of usage. It's not
Okay.
meant as a this is all you need to know. All you need to know is in Azure AD sign-in reports, which is the bottom right here. And Azure AD sign-in reports is the uh, the full is the gold standard way of knowing who's logging into your tenant and your data. And in fact, let me just see if I can quickly. I do have. Hopefully, you can see that. Here's an example of Azure AD sign reports in the demo tenant with very little usage. Now,
Okay.
because my demo tenant has very little usage, I can mess around in here and sort of filter it a bit, and it's all great. But if you're a customer with any sizable amount of usage, you will probably rapidly struggle because there's so much data. Because you get a lot of, there's a lot of data, right,
Yeah,
of
makes
people
sense.
logging in. And so that's where you might want to look at this export data option, which requires, some Azure storage. You can do the Azure workbooks as
Okay.
well, where we have legacy auth workbooks that help you analyze and look at the usage. You can download this data even if you don't have that. So I'll sort of focus here. I'm not going to go into that side of it, but I'm going to just very quickly kind of show you what typically what stuff looks like here.
Okay.
So when you sort of come in here, there's usually an awful lot of usage logged in, or being logged rather. And one of the quick things, just to sort of where's the basic auth usage coming from, is I typically say to customers, look, go and just do a filter by client app, and then on the client app, you then have this delineation, these two types of client app.
Okay.
Modern auth clients at the top, legacy auth, which
I like
in
that.
this case means basic auth on the bottom, and all the
Sure.
different protocols. Now, if you go and select everything on the bottom here and you have a lot of basic auth usage, again, you'll have a lot of data come back. So I know I only have active sync usage in my demo tenant here. So I just want to keep it nice and super simple. And I know that when I look at these records, so here's my user who's logging in, the IP address he's coming from, and I can tell actually that there's this kind of, when I look at the detail of this, I can tell this is basic auth because I chose legacy auth in the filter.
Sure.
Obviously a giveaway.
Sure.
And secondly, I can see that the actual application calling in here is Exchange Online. We'll go and look at an OAuth one in a second, but the application is Exchange Online, not
Okay.
Apple iPhone or Outlook or whatever it might be. And that's because, and I realize this is a subtle nuance here, right? But when a client app connects to Exchange Online on its behalf calls Azure AD, and that's why you see a login record here from Exchange Online and not from the client app itself directly. So it's proxied authentication if you think of it like that. If I get rid of the filter here for a second, and then I'll show, let me find another one. Here's the same user, but the application is showing as Apple Internet accounts. And that's because for this same user, I set up one account with Basic Auth and one account with Modern Auth. And so you can see that in this case, the app ID is the app ID associated with the Mail app on an iPhone. Okay. And so, what you'll see is the same user might have potentially different records. They might have some
Sure.
using Basic Auth and some using Modern Auth. It depends on what applications there are. But this Azure AD Sign Reports is the great kind of detail location where you can get all that detail. So what I typically will say to a customer is use the message center post summary we send to sort of tell you where you should be looking, and then go into Azure AD Sign Reports and get the detail on what you should actually, on the actual kind of logins themselves. Download the data. I typically recommend customers download this data in JSON. Gives them the maximum amount of fields and data to look at. The user agent string is a particularly useful field. The user agent string, for example, I'm just going to very quickly go back and add my filter back, and I'll explain why. If I go back and say, go back to ActiveSync, and then I go find my user, and I say, all right, well, Diego here I know is using ActiveSync, and I know that because ActiveSync is the client app being used. Down at the bottom here, it tells me what the user agent is.
Okay.
And the user agent in this case tells me it's an iPhone. The user agent is not a guaranteed way of confirming exactly what the app is,
Okay.
because it's down to the developer what user agent string they write into the app and they send to us.
Ah, okay.
Now, if I were a bad guy, I probably would not, wanted to write an app and get you to install that. I probably wouldn't write, a user agent string of my evil app version 1.0, right? And send that to you because you would
Okay.
identify it. But the user agent string is more often than not quite helpful in identifying the application that's being used. So
Okay.
if it's a third-party app that you've integrated and it identifies itself, the user agent string might be a great way of identifying what the app is. And then it will help you identify, like, here's the user account, here's what I think the app is, and go start trying to find that application and the application owner and figure out, hey, look, it's using Basic Auth. We need to do something about that, or it's going to stop working sometime after October.
Yeah. So, if somebody's tuning in right now, and we did have another question just to
Yeah,
clarify for the folks that are maybe tuning in a little bit after we started. This is only for Exchange Online, right? We covered
right.
this a little bit earlier on. There are better ways to do modern authentication if you're hosting Exchange on premises,
Yeah,
but this change won't impact an Exchange environment on premises. It's only Exchange Online. And it's so interesting, right? Like I used to think that when Exchange Online came about, eventually everybody'd be in Exchange Online. And as you know, and as I know, that is not the case. We still have a lot of folks that are hosting their own Exchange environment on premises. And it's interesting. So this messaging, want to make sure it's crystal clear. Exchange Online, Exchange on-prem is not affected, but there are better ways to think about authentication on premises. And you said it was the hybrid authentication,
hybrid modern auth
hybrid modern
is a
auth. That's what it
solution
is.
for on-premises customers if they want to
Okay.
use to a better form of auth. But on-prem they have more configuration options.
It's
So,
true. It's
right.
true. It's true.
One other thing I'll call out, and you're quite right, Shannon, that it's important to clarify a couple of things. So again, our Exchange Online only. We're not changing on-prem, though we do recommend customers try and get away from our basic auth on-prem. The other thing I'll call out is just this last bullet here, which is a common question I get too, which is what about SMTP auth? I use SMTP for sending. So SMTP is all about sending mail. POP and IMAP in legacy kind of email clients are about receiving, and SMTP is used for sending. Well, we are not turning off basic auth for SMTP or for SMTP completely. And the reason for that is it's not just email clients that send email. It's scanners and hardware devices, and
Sure.
there's a lot of hardware stuff, firmware based, code, which is used for sending email. And we're not asking customers to replace all of those devices, hardware devices that are sending email today because they can't use modern auth. So we're going to leave basic auth enabled if you want it for SMTP. So these
Okay.
devices can continue to send. Now we've turned it off already if we don't think customers are using it. So if we don't see any usage out for sending mail, SMTP auth in either OAuth or basic auth, we turned it off. In January, I think in 1 week, we turned off 1.6 million tenants SMTP auth
Wow.
in
That's
a
pretty
week,
staggering if you think about it. That's a lot of tenants.
right? And it's funny, my team used to be really nervous about sending, a message center
Can
post
only imagine.
to 500 customers. They were like,
Right.
500 people are going to get this message. Well, now, yesterday we picked 1 million tenants that we know don't use anything, and we're turning them off next week or something. And it's like,
Wow.
now we just, and the only reason we can do that with, I would say, confidence. And again, if I have accidentally broken anyone, I'm really sorry, but genuinely we're trying to do the right thing here, because we know who uses it and who doesn't.
Right.
And so it's very easy to pick stuff to turn off. So if we've turned off SMTP auth, you can turn it back on even after October.
Oh, okay.
So,
So would that be like an
right?
exception?
Nope, you can just go back and turn it back on yourself.
Okay.
So it's a slight odd one. It's like we're turning off the protocols in the top of the slide here, the POP and IMAP and EWS and everything. We're turning them off and they're off. That's it. Done for basic auth.
So
For
and
SM,
no exceptions, right?
correct.
Okay.
Um, and then with SMTP auth, if we've turned it off, you can turn it back on. If you're using it, we haven't touched it, and we'll leave it untouched. Common question then is, when are you going to turn off basic auth for SMTP auth? I have no date in mind yet.
Okay.
That's a long way out.
Maybe
We
we could
do
do
though
another stream in
recommend,
the future.
perhaps, yeah. We do though recommend customers turn it off at the organizational level and just turn it back on at the per user level. So SMTP lets you do that, right? Where you could say the default for everyone is cannot send via basic auth and SMTP and everything. And then you just re-enable it on a per account basis. And that's a much better way of doing it than just saying everyone can send email outbound through SMTP.
So there's another good question that came up, Ritter von Nee. So thanks for the good question. So Ritter von Nee was more interested in whether or not this has any impact on other cloud services, i.e., SharePoint Online. So is that something that's easy to kind of touch
Yep.
on for a little bit here? Because as you know, SharePoint and Exchange kind of always hang out together, right? People are always
Yes.
building things that hook into Exchange and hook into
Mhm.
SharePoint, and the app sort of blends the two together. What type of change would an admin or a developer need to be paying attention to before October 1st?
You're right. SharePoint has depended upon Exchange for
Very
forever.
much so.
Um, this change does not affect SharePoint. SharePoint you can enable basic auth on SharePoint, right?
Okay.
Um, it's not generally recommended, but this change doesn't affect that at all. Anything that integrates with Exchange, so anything that's sending mail or calendaring apps, or there's a lot of Exchange web services apps out there um, that connect to Exchange and get calendar information back. So think of meeting rooms devices, not SharePoint question answer specifically, but we just kind of mention that for a second, which is, those screens outside meeting rooms that show the meeting room, availability and who's booked in them and everything like that. They all use Exchange Web Services to talk to Exchange and pull out calendar data. They probably use EWS or Graph, which they should be. That would be preferable, but they probably use basic auth. So there's a lot of that going on. So I don't see a huge amount of SharePoint apps that integrate in that way, if I'm
Okay.
honest.
Okay.
And I don't hear about a huge number, but be aware of it, that any kind of application, SharePoint trying to, if it's SharePoint Online talking to Exchange Online, then typically that's all going to be OAuth and done magically under the covers, and you don't really have to configure the authentication, right? That's all just within the context of Microsoft 365, and everything's using OAuth under there. But any external application that might come in, whether it be SharePoint or from something else using basic auth, that would be affected, yes.
Okay. Well, great. That kind of takes us to the end of all of the questions we had come up with. Are there any closing thoughts? Anything that, if our community has questions down the road, you're available on Twitter. So it's, what is it? Is it
Yes.
Greg underscore MSFT? Is that
Yeah,
what it is?
I'll put
Greg
that back
Taylor.
up
There we
there
go.
for a second. Yeah. And you know, yeah, I tweet about this kind of stuff. I'm a hoot, you know. No, so I mean, if basic auth is cool, if you were, 'cause I'm going to go back to that. You said that right at the beginning, right?
It's well, modern
Start
auth is
there with that.
cooler.
Modern auth is much cooler. But I mean, I think my I've been working on this for a while, and it's kind of funny. I like turning stuff off, it turns out, right? I like building stuff too, and I've built stuff in Exchange and done a bunch of stuff before. But where I find this interesting is understanding how people use our services, right? Um, and figuring out how to try and reach them and help them understand that stuff changes. I mean, this is a cloud service, right, which is constantly evolving. And I'm surprised how few customers keep up on Message Center. We talked about that a little earlier. That is
Right.
where we communicate pretty important stuff. So I would encourage people to look at that, look at the service health dashboard, be aware of change. It's very difficult for us to sort of, you know, uh, innovate in this service if we have to carry all of this legacy stuff along for the ride. We want customers to come with us on the journey and get rid of some of this stuff. Now, this particular thing is not just an old feature that we want to kill off, right? This is a massive security hole.
Yeah.
This is a customers get breached all the time because of stolen credentials or password spray or all of these different things. And I talk to customers who've been breached because of basic auth. So we are genuinely trying to just make the situation better, protect our customers' data and their accounts from compromise. So, you know, let's do it, right?
Let's do it.
Um,
And for one, I think one in closing, I'll put the link up once more. This is our short URL that takes you to all the documentation on everything to pay attention to, how to convert legacy based authentication apps to more modern based authentication apps. Tune in tomorrow, same time, 8 a.m. Pacific. Do the math wherever you are. And then it'll be live, right? So we'll
yep.
go through an actual demo of what this looks like. And I guarantee you there's going to be some interesting questions tomorrow. So it'll be a good show. Be sure to tune in. And I think what I'm going to do now is I will raid some of our friends just to give them the opportunity to have a couple of extra viewers they normally wouldn't have. So I'm going to go to C Sharp Fritz. So let's start that. Right over here. We'll go to C Sharp as well. And thank you, Greg, for tuning in or for joining us today so that folks would tune in and learn more about this. We will end the stream now and everybody stay tuned for tomorrow.